Well, good morning, friends. Welcome to the fifth week of our summer speaker series, where we are looking at a host of issues and dealing with technology. By now, some of you who are watching online will be familiar with the protocol. Our speaker this morning is online, but he's not online. There's no internet where Ron White, our speaker, is in Southern California, so he is on the phone. Ron, can you say hello?
Good morning. I'm delighted to be with you. It's a long way from Pasadena, California to Washington, D.C. I'm not quite sure why our internet is not working this morning. I apologize. I wish I could be a little more in person, but I'm looking forward to being with you.
Okay, great, Ron. And we're going to be looking at some texts this morning. It is a pleasure to welcome back to National Dr. Ron White. Ron is an American historian and an authority on Abraham Lincoln. He has authored most recently Lincoln in Private, what his most personal reflections tell us about our great president. Ron earned a BA at UCLA, an MDiv from Princeton Seminary, and a PhD in religion and history at Princeton University. I'm going to dispense with the rest of Ron's biography this morning in the interest of time, so it is available on the church website. Abraham Lincoln is a deeply private man, even to those who worked closely with him. He often captured his best thoughts, as he called them, in short notes to himself. Those have recently been published, and Ron has read them, and now is going to offer us this morning the perspective of this president of a nation riven with strife and split into two irreconcilable halves. That's Lincoln's nation, by the way, with each claiming to be the real America. He is going to bring us words of wisdom for today from Abraham Lincoln. Ron, you can take us through the slides and we'll follow you along here in Stone Hall. Friends, would you welcome Ron White virtually?
Thank you, Quinn, for your generous introduction. National is very important to me. Some years ago, I served as a scholar in residence, speaking in the church and for the church throughout the Washington, D.C. area. I also worshiped with you in April when I was in Washington for the 200th anniversary of the birth of Ulysses S. Grant. I'm calling the presentation this morning, Abraham Lincoln, Wisdom for Today. In the 4 presidential historian surveys that have been done in the 21st century, one is done after the change of presidents each time, Lincoln finishes number 1, perhaps to no surprise. And yet there are people who want to take his name off of public schools, who want to take down statues of Lincoln. What is going on? I would remind us that Lincoln is a 19th century person. He can't help us with climate change. He can't tell us what to do in Ukraine. And yet I want to argue this morning that he is a transformative figure who remarkably still speaks to us today. So what I'm doing this morning is taking 6 excerpts from his speeches or letters to try to allow us to focus on him more. When I was a student at UCLA, I had the privilege of singing in the a cappella choir. It was directed by Roger Wagner, the founder of the Roger Wagner Chorale. My junior year, we sang Bach. My senior year, we sang Beethoven. I loved the music, but then I recommended that I didn't really understand it. I think Lincoln's somewhat like this. We love Abraham Lincoln, but do we really understand him? Let's begin. Refreshing our memories, Lincoln was born in 1809 in Kentucky, moved with his family in 1816 to southern Indiana, and then in 1830 to Illinois. He separated from his parents and lived in the small village of New Salem. Our first excerpt is 1832. Think about this. He's 23 years of age. He decides he's going to run for the first time for political office. The way one did that in those days was to post an announcement in a local newspaper. And so Lincoln did. Let's read this. Every man is said to have his peculiar ambition. Whether it be true or not, I can say for one that I have no other so great as that of being truly esteemed of my fellow men by rendering myself worthy of their esteem. How far I shall succeed in gratifying this ambition is yet to be developed. I am young and unknown to many of you. I was born and have ever remained in the most humble walks of life. I have no wealthy or popular relations to recommend. The last sentence meaning that usually these announcements would be followed by recommendations from friends. He had no recommendations in the letter. Each of us really has to face our own ambition. And how does that ambition play out in political life, in family life, in business life, as a lawyer, as a physician? Lincoln makes no apology for his ambition, but notice the way he defines it. This is quite remarkable. Every man is said to have his peculiar ambition. Whether it be true or not, I can say for one that I have no other so great as being truly esteemed by my fellow men, by rendering myself worthy of their esteem. We're coming up, are we not, on a 2022 election? Wouldn't this be wonderful if this was the way politicians today understood their ambition? Rendering myself worthy of the esteem of others. This is the 23-year-old Abraham Lincoln speaking. When I do biography, whether it's Lincoln or Grant, I like to write from what I call the inside out. I'm really interested in not simply what a person did, but the character of that person. And I want to bring this first announcement to you this morning on this 4th of July weekend, because this is Lincoln's character. And I think we should look at our own character and the character of people that we might vote for in 2022 and ask, is this their understanding of his ambition? Rendering myself worthy of their esteem. Well, how is Lincoln going to rise? He fights in the Black Hawk War. He's aware of people around him he becomes a lawyer who are also lawyers. The way that he decides that he will rise in his own life and vocation is by the gift of public speaking. Now remember, Lincoln had but 1 year of public education. Boys in that time would only be allowed education in January and February when it was too cold to work with their fathers in the fields of Kentucky or southern Indiana. And parents would hire kind of traveling teachers, and they would get together 6 or 7 or 8 boys, sadly no girls, boys, and they offered them education in these 2 months, January, February. So we think that Lincoln probably did this 5, maybe 6 times. So he had 10 months, maybe 12 months at best, of public education. Well, the way he discovered that he would rise was by enhancing his gift of public speaking. So he joined what was called the Young Men's Lyceum. This was a group where men learned how to speak, how to debate, how to discuss, how to question. And on this night at the Second Presbyterian Church in Springfield, January 27, 1838, Lincoln gave his first public speech. Now, Lincoln was always very aware of what was the problem, what were the context around him. Just months before he gave this speech, a young Presbyterian minister, Elijah Lovejoy, who lived in Alton, Illinois, was murdered in the street in front of his printing press, because as a Presbyterian minister, he became a very anti-slavery advocate, speaking out against the sin of slavery. And for this, he was killed. So Lincoln determined that the problem of his day was violence, what he called mobocracy. Violence was all across the land. This was the basis of his long speech before the Young Men's Lyceum. This speech has gained a lot of interest and traction just in recent years, and I think you will discover why when I read it. How then shall we perform it? At what point shall we expect the approach of danger? Shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step the ocean and crush us at a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined, with all the treasure of the earth in their military chest, with a Bonaparte for a commander, could not by force take a drink from the Ohio, or make a track on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years? What a remarkable writer. Take a drink from the Ohio or make a track on the Blue Ridge. At what point then is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. You can imagine why this address has suddenly come into our own time of tumult. There is no foreign power that will ever be able to defeat the United States of America. If we are to be defeated, Lincoln is arguing, it will be from within. We will turn against each other. And he uses this incredible metaphor. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. Now, this is 1838. This is 23 years before the beginning of the Civil War. Some have suggested, well, is Lincoln already thinking of a Civil War? I don't think so. But he's very worried about violence. He's very worried about us turning against each other. And for that reason, Lincoln offers wisdom for today. Now, Lincoln runs and wins 4 terms in the Illinois State Legislature. He wins 1 term in the United States Congress, serving from 1847 to 1849. In that United States Congress, he does something quite remarkable for a young congressman. He takes issue with President James Polk and the leading and guiding of the war with Mexico. He stands within a week after taking office and says, tell me the spot on which the Mexicans invaded America. I'm quite convinced it's the other way around. The Americans invaded Mexico and made it seem like they were the aggressors in the war, where they were not. He reminds Polk, you sit where George Washington sat. Please, sir, speak with honesty. Well, Lincoln spoke with honesty, but when he returned home, many of his constituents did not appreciate the fact that he had taken issue with the President of the United States. For some, this almost seemed traitorous. And so he became consigned to the fact that perhaps his political life was over before it had barely begun. And he turned to being a lawyer full-time in 1849 and did so all the way until 1854, until something brought him back into the political fray. What it was the Kansas-Nebraska Act, led through the Senate by his Democratic rival in Illinois, Senator Stephen Douglas. The Kansas-Nebraska Act opened up the possibility that slavery could advance to the territories of the West. Kansas and Nebraska were much, much larger than they are today as states. And so Lincoln, appalled over the idea that one could vote for slavery, what was called popular sovereignty, the people of Kansas or Nebraska could actually vote on slavery. He was enraged by this. And so he comes roaring back into the political fray in 1854, the year the act was passed. And yet, as I try to show in my new book, Lincoln in Private, Lincoln actually did not speak for about 3 months. He held his fire. He took his time. Wouldn't that be wonderful if people could hold their fire? Could take their time? That's difficult to do, isn't it, in the 24/7 news cycle? And he began to think to himself, what is this slavery? So I discovered in writing my book, Lincoln in Private, that 111 of Lincoln's notes to himself have survived. When I say to himself, he wrote them on different scraps of paper. He never dated them, never titled them, never signed them. And yet we know they're Lincoln by his distinctive handwriting. I think this is one of the most remarkable. You'll notice that there's a question mark after it because we're not exactly sure, but we're pretty sure that it was in the summer of 1854. Let me read it for us. If A can prove, however conclusively, that he may have right enslaved B, why may not B snatch the same argument and prove equally that he may enslave A? Oh, you say A is white and B is black. It is color, then, the lighter, having the right to enslave the darker. Take care. By this rule, you are to be a slave to the first man you meet with a fairer skin than your own. I'm sure lawyers in our audience this morning can catch the fact that this is almost Lincoln, the lawyer, striding up and down a courtroom, making his case. He had learned from his second law partner that you have to, first of all, understand the point of view of your opponent. So he puts the point of view of the opponent here and then shoots it down. You do not mean color exactly. You mean whites are intellectually. And notice the way Lincoln underlines the key words. He does this in his public speaking, the first inaugural, the second inaugural, the Gettysburg Address, but he does this in his notes to himself. You mean whites are intellectually the superiors to blacks, and therefore have the right to enslave them. Take care again. By this rule, you are to be slave to the first man you meet with an intellect superior to your own. But say you, it's a question of interest. Lincoln is really meaning here economic interest. If you can make it your interest, you have the right to enslave another. Very well. And if he can make it his interest, he has the right to enslave you. I think this is a remarkable example of the way Lincoln is thinking. He's teasing out his ideas to himself. He's taking his time to do this. When I speak to young people, I will often ask, I've spoken to high schools from Massachusetts to Illinois to Hawaii, and often to 11th graders who are studying American history. And I'll ask them the question, how long do you think it took Lincoln to write these notes? And they will invariably answer, 2 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes. No. I think it took him a long time, maybe an hour or two, to tease out his thinking. Our next excerpt is really remarkable in a very different kind of way. Lincoln was elected president in November of 1860. Inaugurations in those days were later than our January 20th. They were March 4. So he had what was called a long secession winter. He was in Springfield, Illinois. He perhaps didn't even fully realize the turmoil in the country. He wasn't in Washington. But one after another, by the time he gave his inaugural address, 7 southern states had withdrawn from the Union. I also like to say to students, there's no such thing as good writing. There's only good rewriting. So Lincoln wrote out his first inaugural address in Springfield, and then he showed it to several different friends, his Illinois friends. Only one made any substantive suggestion. He arrives in Washington on February 23. He is met by William Seward, his chief rival originally for president, now his Secretary of State. Seward invites him to join him for church at St. John's Church on Sunday morning. And after lunch, Lincoln gives to Seward his inaugural address. And he says, "Sir, I know that you're a wonderful speaker. If you have any suggestions for my speech, I'd be very happy to hear them." Well, that very evening, there was a knock on the door of Parlor Suite 6 at what they then called Willard's Hotel. At the door was Seward's son. He said, "Sir, my father has read your address, and here are his suggestions." Can you imagine the look on Lincoln's face when Seward's son handed him 7 pages of suggestions? 49 suggestions on how to change and improve Lincoln's inaugural address. No one had ever done this to Lincoln before. Lincoln actually accepted 27 of the 49 suggestions, but he must have really been flummoxed when he got to the last page when Seward said, "As for your final paragraph, it will not do. Here, I have written 2 new last paragraphs for you. You may choose which one you would like to do." So here I'm going to ask us to do something together. You know, in the 19th century and always before, people read out loud. This whole idea of reading silently, that's a whole 20th century phenomenon. Nobody ever read silently until before. So I don't want us to read silently or listen to me silently. What I've done here is to put in 2 columns. On the left column is Seward's 4 sentences. of the last paragraph of the first inaugural. On the right column is Lincoln's 4 sentences of the way he edits Seward's words. So let's say these out loud. You may be at home, you may be in Stone Hall, I'm in Pasadena, California, but let's say them together. First, we will say, Seward, I close. I encourage you to say it out loud. Lincoln, I am loath to close. Now, what's going on here? Well, usually when we edit, I think we know this, we often cut. We want to cut those extra adjectives or those extra adverbs. But Lincoln doesn't cut. Well, it's pretty hard to cut 2 words. He actually extends that first sentence. What is he doing? Say it out loud again and listen slowly to the sound. I am loath to close. You hear what grammarians would call assonance in this sentence. It is so much more dramatic. He extends it. I am loath to close. He doesn't want to close yet. So much more dramatic than Seward. Seward's second sentence, although passion has strained our bonds of affections too hardly, they must not, I am sure they will not be broken. Let's say Lincoln's words out loud together wherever you are. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. Do you see what Lincoln is doing here? He is making more concise and therefore more dramatic Seward's words. He's taking Seward's words, but he's refining them. And then, I stepped ahead of us, didn't I? I missed the second sentence. I got going too quickly, pardon me. Let's go back 1 sentence. We must not be aliens or enemies, but fellow countrymen and brethren. Lincoln, we are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. This is where Lincoln again has wisdom for today. We are all Americans. We may differ on ideas or policy, but there aren't lesser Americans and better Americans and real Americans. And now Lincoln is speaking to a divided nation and saying, we must not be enemies. We are friends. This is Lincoln's magnanimity, which will finally come out at the very end of the war when he offers his second inaugural. And then the final sentence, I can imagine Lincoln reading this final sentence and sort of saying, oh my goodness, this is pretty long. Seward, the mystic chords which proceeding from so many battlefields and so many patriot graves pass through all the hearts and all the hearts in this broad continent of ours will yet again harmonize in their ancient music when breathed upon by the guardian angel of the nation. And Lincoln may be thinking to himself, what can I do with this? But what he does with this is some of the most memorable words of Abraham Lincoln. The mystic chords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be by the better angels of our nature. You notice what he's doing here. For Seward, it was sort of third person. It was a little bit abstract. Notice how Lincoln personalizes it in one of the most memorable phrases that we all know, by the better angels of our nature. It is up to us to do this. We have a responsibility. I just love the way Lincoln takes Seward's words, edits them, and makes them memorable in one of his greatest speeches. Moving ahead, the Civil War goes forward. It doesn't go well. The North initially believes it will win quickly within 3 months or more. It has more than twice as many men in arms, a much greater industrial might. But now it's beginning to be called Mr. Lincoln's War, as especially in 1862, things do not go well. At the end of August 1862, the North suffers yet another defeat, the second defeat of Bull Run or Manassas. Lincoln calls an emergency cabinet meeting. I'm so happy that 3 of his cabinet secretaries kept diaries. And one of them, his attorney general from Missouri, recorded in his diary that Lincoln said he was wrung by the bitterest of anguish, that he was almost ready to hang himself. Almost ready to hang himself. Then we believe, and notice the question mark here, that very afternoon, September 2nd, Lincoln sat down and wrote this remarkable word to himself. He never thought we'd ever see it, or no one would see it. It's only brief, but it's Lincoln's, I believe it's a kind of a testimony to his own faith journey. Let me put this in a larger context before we read it. I told you that Lincoln grew up in Kentucky and southern Indiana. It was a time of what was called the Second Great Awakening, a revival of religion, a very emotional kind of religion. Lincoln's parents were members of Baptist churches, and he would go as a boy to listen to the sermons, very emotional. And then he would come out, stand up on a stump, and repeat literally the minister's sermons word for word with all the gesticulations and all the emotion until his father hit him on the backside and told him to go home. So Lincoln did what some of us have done, or our children or our grandchildren have done. He rejected the Christian faith. But by the time he got to New Salem, Illinois, he actually wrote a paper criticizing the Bible and what he called revealed religion. A number of witnesses tell us that one of the men in the village ripped it out of his hand and tossed it into the fire. Not a smart thing to do for a person running for political office. And then, as it will for every one of us, life begins to tumble in. First, in 1850, Lincoln loses his son, Eddie. Mary and Abraham's son, Eddie, dies at age 3.5. In 1862, in February of 1862, they lose Willie, age 11. Now Lincoln is beginning to rethink his Christian faith. He had attended from time to time the First Presbyterian Church in Springfield, but now when he comes to Washington, he really begins to attend the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. Its minister is first in his class at Princeton Seminary. Is an important person in Lincoln's life. And so we get to this private meditation. Lincoln has been thinking about the meaning of the Christian faith. The will of God prevails. In great contests, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God. Both may be and one must be wrong. Notice how he underlines those words. This is the logical Lincoln thinking. Both may be and one must be wrong. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. And then this remarkable sentence. In the present Civil War, it is quite possible that God's purpose is something different from the purpose of either party. And yet the human instrumentalities, working just as they do, are of the best adaptation to effect his purpose. You and I, as Presbyterians, are heirs of the Reformed tradition. It's a wonderful tradition. It affirms at the same time that God is the one who acts in our life, and yet we are given responsibility to respond to God's actions. This is what he's saying in this sentence. In the present Civil War, it is quite possible that God's purpose is something different from the purpose of either party, and yet the human instrumentalities, you and me, working just as we do, are of the best adaptation, the best way to affect God's purpose. I'm almost ready to say this is probably true, that God wills this contest, and wills that it shall not end yet by his mere quiet power. An interesting choice of words. I think Lincoln had become tired of the noisy God he had met as a youth, so he describes God as his mere quiet power on the minds of the now contestants. He could have either saved or destroyed the Union without a human contest. And having begun, he could give the final victory to either side any day. Wait a second. Do you mean, President Lincoln, that God might give the victory to the Confederacy? Well, you know now why he wrote this out in private. Why, this was a note to himself. He wasn't going to say that in public, but he's thinking it in private. Yet the contest proceeds. Well, now we skip forward to our last fragment, last part of. This is his second inaugural speech. No one in the audience that day knew that he had written this meditation on the divine will. Remember, I said it was never titled. Actually, John Hay, his young secretary, found it after his death and wrote on top of it, Meditation on the Divine Will. That was not Lincoln's title. That was John Hay's title, but a good title, so it's still there in the original copy that resides in the library at Brown University, John Hay's alma mater. What I've done finally here is to just pick out several aspects of this second inaugural address. I've written a whole book on this. When I first did, I wondered, will people read a whole book on 701 words? This is the second shortest inaugural address ever given. George Washington offered the shortest. There was no tradition. He said, I like to summarize, thank you very much, in 135 words. But now Lincoln offers his second inaugural, and it's remarkable. In 701 words, he mentions God 14 times, quotes the Bible 4 times, invokes prayer 3 times. Well, I'd been told when I turned to study Abraham Lincoln by my academic colleagues, don't get excited, we always quote Bible verses. Well, we do today, but I read the previous 18 addresses before Abraham Lincoln. The Bible had been quoted only 1 time by John Quincy Adams, quoting the Psalms. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. So in the middle of this address, Lincoln suddenly says, both read the same Bible and pray to the same God. Lincoln here is using inclusive language. This is part of what I want to emphasize this morning is his wisdom for today. Instead of using polarizing language, the kind of language that we're using today, the us and the them, the they and the we, he's always using inclusive language. Both. He's talking about the Confederacy. The soldiers of the Confederacy read the Bible every bit as much as the soldiers of the Union Army and pray to the same God, and then semicolon. Well, we've allowed the semicolon to drop out of our language. We should keep it, because here Lincoln stops for a moment and then shifts the emphasis of that sentence, and each invokes his aid against the other. What he's really saying in the burden of the whole address is, how dare one side invokes the aid of the other, of God against the other? Is God a territorial God? Is God a tribal God? Is God only the God of the Union and not the God of the people who live in the South? And then he starts his first of 4 biblical verses. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. If you could see me this morning, I would have a Bible in my hand. And on the one hand, I would put the Bible out there, back there, to say, yes, the Bible is the foundation of everything that we do, but we must be careful that it's not simply a book that talks about 2,000 years ago. It is a book that talks about today. And so Lincoln is now taking this old verse from Genesis and applying it today. What do I mean? What did he mean? He's saying what's really going on here is that the men of the South are using slavery to wring their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. And yet Lincoln again puts in a semicolon. I think he may have looked at the sentence, the verse that he had just written, and said, oh, wait a second, Lincoln, that sounds pretty harsh. And he immediately balances it by saying, but let us judge not, that we be not judged. This is Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And so the audience that came that day, I've read their letters and diaries, they came, this might surprise you, deeply angry. They were angry because if you think about it, everyone at that second inaugural would have lost a father, husband, son, brother. And they were very angry at the people of the South. We can be very angry at the other side of the political debate. But Lincoln wants us to know, let us judge not, that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. And so I'm skipping now to what would be the final paragraph In every sermon that you hear at National, wherever I worship this morning at San Marino Community Church, there really are two parts of a sermon. The first is what I call the injunction. This is where the minister imparts to us the story of the Christian faith, the life, teaching, death, and resurrection of Jesus, what God has done. Then the final part of the sermon is what I call the imperative. It's done differently according to each minister, but invariably I suspect the minister is going to say something like, and in this coming week, therefore, I ask you to what? Live a life of more forgiveness, live a life that is more loving, live a life that is more caring. I suggest that when we get to the final paragraph of Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural, the injunction, the first three paragraphs are, the Almighty has his own purposes. The imperative, let's put in an unvoiced therefore, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Oh, I didn't say that in the parade, which in those days was before the inaugural address, there was a Washington newspaper handing out copies of its morning paper to people in the crowd saying, this is the day that Lincoln should crow a bit. He's been criticized all these years. He's got to stand up and take credit. Do you know that Lincoln disappears in his greatest speeches? In the Gettysburg Address, he uses not one personal pronoun. In the second inaugural, he uses but two personal pronouns. Can you imagine a modern politician doing that? So what Lincoln is suggesting here is not anger, not self-congratulation, but forgiveness, reconciliation. That's why we need to hear Lincoln today. That's the wisdom that he offers to us today, to forgive each other, to give those with whom we believe we are in opposition. They might be members of our own family, and then to reach out in reconciliation. Thank you, Quinn. Now, I can't see anybody, but I'm very open to the way you might help us understand the comments or the questions, and I'll be very pleased to respond.
Let's express our appreciation. Well, Ron, you've been in this hall before. There are 70 folks here gathered in person. There are another 40 online.
Let's not mention how he became an attorney. Did he read or tell me that?
Thank you very much. There were really almost no law schools. There were only 2 law schools in the West when he became a lawyer. And what he did was interesting. Most people became lawyers and then politicians. He was a politician who then became a lawyer. And the way he did that was he read law in the office of John Stewart, who would become his first partner. And then he became a junior partner. And then he simply presented himself. And the presentation was as much moral character as it was knowledge of the law. And so he became a lawyer in 1836. Remember, the first excerpt was running for office in 1832. I failed to say he lost that election. But he actually won 199 of the 203 votes around New Salem. He won election in 1834, and 36, and 38, and 40. He became a lawyer in 1836 and became really a remarkable lawyer, one of the great lawyers of his state. Thank you for that question.
Ron, this is a question from online. If Lincoln had lived, that is, if he hadn't been assassinated, how do you think history might have changed or at least been different?
Thank you for that question. Very, very important. Well, he was assassinated 41 days after he delivered the second inaugural address. And the person who succeeded him, Andrew Johnson, was a disaster. How did they select vice presidents in those days? Lincoln may not have even known Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was the only Democrat who stayed within the Union. had become then a senator and then military governor of Tennessee. And so the thought was that they could balance the ticket. For example, the first ticket in 1860, they balanced. Lincoln was west, Illinois was west in those days, with Hannibal Hamlin, who was north, who was New England, Maine. And so Johnson just was a total disappointment, tried to block all of the Republican efforts at Reconstruction amendments, the 13th, well, actually the 14th and 15th. Ulysses S. Grant succeeded him and tried to restore Lincoln's legacy and pattern of reconciliation. Lincoln won a decisive second election. He was the one person who combined this kind of toughness and yet magnanimity towards the South. It would have been very difficult because I don't think anybody quite imagined what became known as the lost cause. Very quickly, the South, putting in place former Confederate generals and newspaper editors, argued that they were the best side, that the only reason they lost in this lost cause was because they were overwhelmed by the larger military of the North, by the industrial might, that they were the more Christian part of the nation. And yet, if anyone could have led the nation through this turmoil, it would have been Lincoln. And so we will never know what might have happened. It was a different kind of nation than Lincoln had lived into, but wouldn't have been marvelous if he would have lived and taken the nation forward. Because as we know, for the next at least 100 years, perhaps we're seeing it play out even today, this division between South and North continued into our history.
I've observed that Lincoln was the first real person who was portrayed on a regular U.S. coin in 1909 on his centennial of his birth. I wonder if you know anything about the debates going on about whether that should be done. Previously, of course, coins just had a symbolic representation of liberty.
What a fascinating question. I've been just in the last week or two, in regard to another biography I'm writing, looking at that centennial of 1909, and I didn't know as much as you knew that this was the first time Lincoln's image was on a coin. So I have to say, I plead ignorance. I don't know how that happened and why that happened. I know that in the 1909, everything possible was done for Lincoln. The Lincoln Highway, here we have the Lincoln coin. That centennial was a remarkable event, but I don't really know the backstory of how that came to be.
Since you've also written about Grant, were Lincoln and Grant close at all?
Thank you for your question. They had what I would call a mutual admiration society. Why? They were both men of the West. Lincoln had to deal with McClellan, who always wanted more, who always overestimated the enemy, who was kind of a pompous kind of fellow. He'd gone through 4 different commanding generals until he got to Grant. Grant didn't ask for too much. He never complained. He was just kind of a down-home kind of guy who wasn't self-possessed and self-promoting. They only met 4 times, and yet Grant had a remarkable ability, a remarkable praise for Lincoln. When Grant writes his memoirs, which again today are becoming more in prominence as we revalue the position of Grant as among presidents, he argues and says very pointedly, Lincoln is the greatest person of our time. So he just absolutely marveled at Lincoln. As Grant's success was coming forward, there was a rumor out there that maybe Grant would run for president in 1864. And Lincoln was really worried about this because this guy was really capturing the nation's imagination. So he put out his feelers to one of Grant's friends and said, "Is this really true?" "Oh, no, 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 no." He said, "Grant is not going to run for president. He will support you totally because he's deeply admiring of you." So they really admired each other.
Internationally, how were Lincoln's words considered in the late 1800s in other countries, and the impact of the words?
Another excellent question. I was surprised as I did research to try to determine the answer to your question. For a long, long time, almost to the end, the Times of London, which was the newspaper, but also kind of an elite newspaper, called him the village lawyer, and demeaned, if you can believe this, demeaned the Gettysburg Address. this was just really beneath, educated language. But when the second inaugural came out, the British press, a whole variety of British press praised it. One press said, it's almost as if God has chosen the foolish things of this world, a man of little education, to shame the wise. Another said, if this address had been given by any other American, this is the 19th century now, it would have been arrogant. They believed Americans were arrogant. But this is not arrogant. This is offered by a man of great humility. So at the end, the second inaugural was very much praised by the British press.
Could you go into a little more detail on Lincoln's view of slavery? I mean, my understanding is that his goal, his purpose, at least at the beginning of the Civil War, was to save the Union, not to abolish slavery. That although he believed slavery was morally wrong, as you've demonstrated, he thought that it was just a bridge too far to eliminate slavery and save the Union at the same time. And I guess, as my American history professor banged on the rostrum repeatedly and said, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free any slaves.
Wow. Well, I agree with what you're saying. Lincoln started this war to save the Union. He did not believe the Constitution gave him the right to deal with slavery where it already existed. His understanding, which is enunciated in the Gettysburg Address also, that the whole meaning of freedom could not be really fulfilled unless everyone is free. Now, everyone did not include women, but every male person could be free. He believed the Declaration of Independence was not a finished document, but was an aspirational document, and we still had things to do to be sure that all men are created equal. He also saw that the idea of, through Grant and others, that allowing African Americans to fight after the Emancipation Proclamation, originally that proclamation just meant that African Americans could serve in the military, not in the front line, but it would free more white men to serve as soldiers. So yes, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free all slaves. It freed slaves in Confederate territory. So there's an evolving issue here. Lincoln also was early on, for a long time, part of what was called the colonization movement. The idea that maybe blacks and whites could not live together in the United States and that they would be better off moving to Liberia. But that movement has been much misunderstood in the last couple of years, where people have tried to take down Lincoln, because many African American leaders were part of the colonization movement. African American ministers believing that this was a chance to Christianize Africa by sending African Americans back. So Lincoln's on a journey in terms of slavery. His ideas are evolving. He's never an abolitionist, and it's hard for us to appreciate that abolitionists in that day were really viewed as way to the left, a bunch of crackpots, a bunch of overzealous, a bunch of self-righteous people. Lincoln was anti-slavery. One final word, I don't want to take too much of your question. 3 men from Kentucky came to visit him in 1864, very upset that African American men were leaving the agricultural fields of Kentucky to join the Union Army. He says to these men, I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel. Lincoln was not a feeling person. He was a rational person. But here he says, I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel. I think Lincoln felt for the plight of African Americans.
Could you perhaps channel Lincoln's thoughts, transformative thoughts on the issue that has broken this week, which is abortion, where some have likened it to Lincoln's vision that we can not exist as a nation half slave and half free, because it's a moral issue on people's behalf that is absolutist, depending on which side of the issue you're on. Could you perhaps help us how Lincoln might address that topic?
Well, it's a absolutely marvelous topic, and the way you phrase it, that we're going to end up kind of with two groups of states in the same union. But here I have to draw back. Once upon a time, I was attending a lecture by David McCullough, and someone asked him a question about a contemporary issue, and he said, "I'm an historian." So I'm very wary of trying to suggest how Lincoln would respond to an issue that was not part of his understanding. I get the impetus of your question. I think it's an issue we should be talking about, but I don't want to presume how Lincoln would respond to it. He would respond to the idea of the division in our country and how disastrous this is for us going forward. I don't think he could respond to the particular issue.
Ron, that was skillfully answered.
I just have one question. What's missing from this paper is the Gettysburg Address. Could you just make a couple comments about that?
Yes, the Gettysburg Address is but 272 words. The main speaker that day was Edward Everett. Lincoln was, I don't want to say an afterthought, but he only got word about 2 weeks in advance that, oh, as President of the United States, we'd like for you to say a few appropriate words. And so at the time, it wasn't completely understood how great it was. Edward Everett spoke 2 hours and 8 minutes. In a very pompous way, he took his printed address, walked forward, put it on a table, and then said it from memory. When Lincoln was traveling from Springfield to Washington to become the 16th president, Edward Everett, who was the greatest orator of the day, formerly president of Harvard, wrote in his diary, "Oh my goodness, this is not a man of much learned. Oh, I'm so disappointed in what he's saying in these little addresses on the train stops. Oh, what is this person going to be?" Just really panned Lincoln. The next day, after the Gettysburg Address, Edward Everett wrote a note to Lincoln in which he said, "Sir, I would have been pleased if I could have said in 2 hours what you said in 2 minutes." Edward Everett immediately grasped the wonder and the beauty of those words. And I'd like to point out, which is again missing, is that the language in there of like the new birth of freedom, this has always been interpreted only as a political statement. What is new birth? This is all Christian language. The prayer revival of 1858, which was sweeping the nation, was putting into the nation's language all kinds of Christian language. And so I would like to argue that the Gettysburg Address is not simply a political address, but again, it's evidence of Lincoln's own faith journey, and it really is filled with Lincoln's understanding of what a new birth is all about.
Ron, thank you. Actually, there's one quick follow-up from online to this question, and this really will be our last one. What should we do when we see Lincoln's speeches removed from spaces such as, apparently, Cornell has just done this by removing the Gettysburg Address from their library, speaking of the Gettysburg Address?
Oh my gosh, this is so awful. I have to be careful of the way I'm going to respond here. You know, it betrays such an ignorance of American history, of the fact that Lincoln's on a journey. And to me, it comes across that we are so morally superior. Are we not? We are morally superior to these people of the 18th and 19th century. How dare they do such a thing as that? I mean, my goodness, the Gettysburg Address is one of the great addresses, not simply for the United States. I could tell you of my speaking around the world and what people in other countries think of Abraham Lincoln. He is the personification of what is the best in America.
Well,
thank you very much. Thank you for
let's express our appreciation. I'd like to offer a brief closing prayer. Would you join me? Gracious God, we're grateful for technology and that we got it to work this morning. We're grateful for Ron and for his devotion to the work that he is about, and especially for his love for, but his skillful way of helping us to learn from Abraham Lincoln. We thank you for President Lincoln and for the preservation of his wise words, and we pray that we might take them to heart as Christians, as citizens, as your people, the church, and your people, the United States of America. Lord, would you refine the gold, as the great hymn writer wrote, in America the Beautiful. and bring us self-control in liberty and law. We ask all this in Christ's name and for his sake. Amen.